Do you guys remember playing the original Doom made for the MS-DOS on your parents' gigantic computer back in 1993? Well, I don't, because I wasn't born then, but the point is that the game was probably really awesome back in the day. You could run around these massive 3D levels and shoot demons with these cool guns. It might not seem like much now, but this was the bee's knees back then. And you know what's the best part? It was that the original Doom could pretty much be played on any device because of how compact it was and how little resources it took up. This entire game is only 2 megabytes worth of storage space. My Samsung smart fridge can probably run this game. But those were back during the simpler days, when games weren't 120 gigabytes that required a pre-download, strict system requirements, and a day one patch. The games just worked straight out of the box, and you didn't have to connect to an awful online service in order to download it. You just take the disc or cartridge, you put it into your console, and you play it instantly. Imagine that! And not only were they simple to start up, but they also ran incredibly smooth as well, something that stopped being as common as time went on. As gaming technology has gotten better and better, so too did the games, and with that, the amount of system load has drastically increased. Nowadays, a lot of games struggle to even hold a steady 30 FPS, or not frame skip every other second, or just being free of bugs and glitches. It really feels like modern video games have forgotten the art of optimization. Look, I know video games are hard to make, like really hard to make. Gathering a team of people, all with wildly different skill sets, to collaborate with each other for the next few years of their lives in order to produce this one piece of entertainment that they have no idea if people will even like. That in of itself is such a Herculean task that most people don't even bother entering game development. Not to mention all the other negative aspects of working in the industry, like the low pay, the soul-crushing crunch time, the lack of job security, the stressful work environment, and the high likelihood of burnout, among other things. There are a million objectives that are on a developer's mind when working on a project. They're frantically putting whatever the higher-ups and corporate publishers are demanding of them. They want a huge open world, they want a live service monetization model, they want a title to be out by a certain deadline, they want a mansion on the moon. 2 of them. Modern video game development has become so stressful to the point where devs hardly think about optimizing their titles before they push it out the door anymore. Making sure that the final release build of the game actually functions in the hands of the average consumer is the last thing on the list of their priorities. Their main focus is most likely going to be pushing the game out the door by their designated deadline, regardless of how well it runs. It doesn't matter whether or not the features are complete or whether the game even performs at a functional level to the average consumer on release, because those things can be fixed in a later patch. The most important thing to them is cramming every single marketing feature that the corpo suits required to be in the game. There's this concept in business called the MVP, no, not mega veiny penis, minimum viable product, which is the version of the consumer product that includes only what's considered the essential features, or the bare minimum. And the bare minimum in most cases is that the game boots up and somewhat looks like what is advertised. This mindset might work in other industries, but for the gaming one specifically, it's been insanely detrimental because more and more games are being released in a broken or an unfinished state to the point where it's been normalized in this industry. It's a common occurrence nowadays for a title to release in a completely broken state, one that's legitimately unplayable to a lot of people. Then, after the consumers who got suckered into purchasing it rightfully complain about the horrible optimization, the studio puts up a generic boilerplate apology. I lost count of how many we've collected at this point. What is it now, like 8? 9? That's really bad, not to mention the recently launched titles this year that also have poor optimization, but we never got an apology for. The late Shigeru Miyamoto once said, "A delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is bad forever." And he was right. When a title launches in a rushed state, they usually never recover from the bad publicity they get from it and are mocked till the end of time. I still remember back when Star Wars Jedi Survivor came out and I bought the game day one on Steam, and the PC version was the biggest piece of garbage that I've ever experienced with a AAA game. And it had nothing to do with the gameplay. That was fine. It was just that the optimization was so awful. I literally could not even get past the title screen before crashing. It was legit unplayable. Thankfully though, Steam has a pretty generous return policy, so I just returned it and bought it on console instead, which worked way better. But experiences like mine aren't uncommon, and most of the time can cause huge negative backlash with the consumers. Remember the state of Cyberpunk 2077 back when it was released in 2020? It was a complete and utter dumpster fire. There were hundreds of bugs and glitches, some were minor visual ones, and others were very game-breaking that legitimately prevented progress. And let's not forget the extremely poor performance that it had with all systems, which weren't mentioned in any of the reviews of the game because the reviewers were given a completely different copy than what was sold to us. Not only that, but it was just missing a lot of features that were promised in the marketing and advertising. Even the consoles weren't safe from this either. They ran just as poorly as it did on PC. You know it's bad when even Sony starts offering refunds. This was a complete and total disaster from CD Projekt Red that destroyed their reputation that they've been carefully building up for over 20 years, all gone in a matter of days. Cyberpunk 2077 was supposed to be one of the biggest games to ever release, and it was in development for almost 10 years, yet it still needed another year in the oven to really iron out the performance issues. Now fast forward to today, and Cyberpunk is in a much better spot because the devs have tirelessly worked on fixing it ever since the major backlash to its launch, which should have never been a thing in the first place. And this is one of the only games where the devs were actually successful in fixing their game. Most of the time they're not, and the game is pretty much left in that broken state forever. For example, everyone knows and loves the Pokemon games. They were responsible for forging some of our best childhood memories. They were engaging, they were awesome, and most importantly, they worked right out of the box. And for years it's been that way until Game Freak made the transition from 2D to 3D, and with that came a whole host of issues which I'm not going to get into. But one of the main issues that they've never been able to remedy are the performance issues of the more recent Pokemon titles such as Scarlet and Violet. The graphics weren't really that impressive or anything, however the frame rate constantly dips below 30 FPS, there were frequent pop-ins and stuttering, and not to mention the plethora of bugs and visual glitches. Some people might say that the performance issues were due to the hardware of the Switch not being able to keep up, which I don't think is really true because the other games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom ran just fine. It was only with Scarlet and Violet where performance was a problem, which meant that Game Freak simply didn't prioritize optimization during the development process. And we could see that with their newest game announcement, Beast of Reincarnation, where they just brazenly show the frame drops in their own official trailer. At first, I couldn't believe my own two eyes when I heard that Game Freak was working on a non-Pokemon game for the first time in 2 decades. Then, when I saw that it ran slower than Aunt Jemima's maple syrup, I was like, yep, that's a Game Freak game alright. And it's actually kind of depressing seeing how normalized it is for game studios to only really care about making sure their games run well after they're released. They're not even worried about showing frame drops in their official media anymore. Another studio that famously struggles with optimization is Capcom, and they've had this problem for a very long time now. Almost all of their games that they've released within the past 5 years have had some sort of issue with their PC ports. The extremely hyped Monster Hunter World's PC port was released back in August of 2018 to extremely unfavorable reviews, not because people didn't like the game, but because the PC version was nearly unplayable. The mouse and keyboard controls were messed up, the graphics were extremely muddy and low resolution, and the frame rate struggled to even reach 60 FPS on many setups. Monster Hunter World's PC optimization was so bad that it received overwhelming negative backlash the day it was released on Steam, and it took Capcom years to fix all of these issues so that the game could run decently on its PC port. So after all this negative publicity, have they learned their lesson after all these years? Well, no, not really, because 6 years later with the launch of Monster Hunter Wilds, Capcom still has problems with their PC optimization. Right now, the game is sitting at an overwhelmingly negative rating on Steam almost 5 months after release because many players have still been experiencing poor performance even with all the post-launch updates. Many people are still complaining about crashes, texture pop-ins, inconsistent frame rates, and a whole load of visual bugs. It's clear that in the current day, Capcom still struggles with porting their games over to PC, as Dragon's Dogma 2 had a lot of the same issues as well. What I've noticed with all of these cases is that the console versions of these titles seem to never really run into these problems, or at least not as often as PC does. Why is that though? Why can't these studios just make them both run smoothly? Well, it's because developing for a PC port is generally more difficult than consoles. There are so many variables to consider when porting for a PC, like what GPU do they have, what CPU do they have, are they running Nvidia or AMD drivers, how much RAM do they have? Everyone's PC hardware is different, and what might work for one configuration might not work for another. And because of that, it's kinda difficult to make a one-size-fits-all version of the game that runs super smoothly on every setup out there. Meanwhile, all consoles have one set of software and one set of hardware that they have to develop for. It's straightforward and easier to think about. That's why many studios prioritize a console release first before PC, even though technically PC has a larger audience. Why Sony still hasn't ported Bloodborne over to PC yet after 10 years is still a mystery to me. Like, do they just not want money? Even modders are starting to make their own ports of the game that run set 60 FPS natively, so just do it, Sony, it's right there. Anyways, what do you think? Do you agree or disagree? Let me know down below and make sure to like, comment, subscribe for more content in the future. See ya.